For once, I don't really know where to start, but I suppose we should start with the race winner, Max Verstappen. What a win for him, and it's a win that absolutely cements his 4th World Championship for me. He started in 17th, and yes, there were a few empty grid spots ahead of him, but he had a really good start, did some brilliant overtakes into turn 1 early on to get up to 6th place. There was a bit of good luck with the red flag. At that point in the race, cars behind him had already stopped for intermediate tyres, either during the VSC or during live racing conditions, Charles Leclerc. But Max was on used inters that were almost slicks at that point with more raining coming. He was going to have to stop. And if he didn't do that during the safety car, it would have meant he would have had to have done it during racing conditions. That would have put him further back, obviously, and he would have had quite a lot of cars to get through. So at that point, maybe the win would have been out of reach. But based on pace when he was in clear air and his overtaking into turn 1, I really don't think anyone can say Max didn't deserve this win. His pace at the end when leading was fantastic. His car control was brilliant. He looked so confident on the brakes, far more confident than anyone else out there. Ocon and Verstappen gambled out front when the safety car was deployed. The drivers ahead had pitted under the VSC. Leclerc actually pitted really early on, and Norris and Russell, who were leading at the time, pitted right at the end of the VSC, so when it ended, they were still in the pits. But when they finally came out, Verstappen was ahead of them and up to 2nd place. But importantly, he still needed to change those tyres. If the race remained under the safety car, he would have likely have pitted not long after it. He would have fallen far back, and I think at that point it would have put the win out of reach. Instead, he and Ocon stayed out, and after the red flag restart, Max made his race with an overtake from so far back into turn 1 on Ocon, catching him off guard really, but that's what guaranteed him the race win. It was a champion's drive from Max Verstappen, and there is absolutely no way back in this title fight for Lando Norris now. Something unprecedented would have to happen for him to overhaul the points deficit to Max Verstappen. We could talk about Norris being unlucky. We can say that the red flag situation was unfortunate with the cars ahead being able to change tyres. Sure. We can then talk maybe though about some of the mistakes that he made, falling behind Charles Leclerc, falling behind George Russell. Ultimately, it wasn't a great day in the office for Lando Norris. He started pole, ended up 6th. But of course, the big talking point was the start. Well, the second start. Lance Stroll spun on the formation lap, but he was completely safe on the runoff down to turn 4. But when he was turning around, he decided to drive through the gravel and got stuck. I've seen some stupid things in my time watching Formula 1, but this was right up there. When the start was abandoned, Lando thought he was meant to do another formation lap, started to leave the grid, followed by Russell, Tsunoda and Lawson. This, however, wasn't what he was meant to do. The green lights were not on the grid, and instead they were amber and it said abandoned start. This is a starting procedure breach, and the stewards decided to investigate after the race, presumably so they could speak to the drivers. The 4 drivers that initially left the grid were investigated. The other drivers did follow, but they did so under instructions from race control, because if the leaders went round, they would have lapped the field, the timing would have been all off, it would have been an absolute nightmare. So that's why the rest of the grid weren't investigated, because they were told to go around by race control. Ultimately, Norris avoided a penalty and was given a fine and a reprimand, and I don't really understand why. This was the stewards' ruling, and they talk about what Norris did, leaving the grid when the lights were amber and it did state abandoned start. They also said that his action caused drivers behind to also leave the grid, but they didn't actually say why they decided not to give him a more severe penalty or what any extenuating circumstances might have been. I felt for sure he would receive a minimum of a time penalty, but the steward's ruling was particularly vague on any details around that. It was just a day to forget really for Lando Norris. We have to talk about Alpine though. Ocon and Gasly getting a double podium for Alpine was incredibly good for the Enstone team, especially considering how poor Alpine have been this season and the news that they are abandoning their 2026 engine project, a much needed boost for the team. Both Gasly and Ocon had really good pace in the wet conditions, which is hilarious because at the start of the season I was convinced that Alpine car was a boat, and then it comes alive in the wet conditions. So I mean, I'm just saying. Ocon had a genuine chance to win the race. After the restart, or, you know, one of the restarts, he was leading with Max Verstappen behind him, and he actually built a bit of a gap to Max. He pulled away with no one ahead of him, causing spray, and it is a lot easier usually for the car leading. Once Verstappen overtook him though, after yet another restart, he didn't have the pace to keep up. Ocon's race was made really by not pitting when other cars around him did, but he cemented that second place, and his teammate cemented third on pace. He took the gamble and it paid off. A great result for Alpine. I didn't even cover qualifying with all the red flags that happened there. The fact that it was even moved from Saturday to Sunday, all of the incidents, all of the car damage. Alex Albon didn't even make the start of the race because of the damage he sustained in his qualifying crash. And not only did Colapinto also crash in qualifying, but he also lost control into the safety car in the race, meaning Williams are in real trouble with parts and the cost cap going into the last few races. Aston Martin were another one who really struggled. Fernando Alonso saying he was in a lot of pain during the race, and the only reason he finished was for the mechanics, because they'd obviously had to repair 2 cars. Just a sidebar as well, Charles Leclerc is only 24 points behind Lando Norris in the Drivers' Championship. So Norris could end up not only missing out on the title, which is all but guaranteed now, but he could end up losing out to Leclerc for second place as well, which would be crazy given the performance for a long time of that McLaren. Ultimately, winning is all that drivers really care about though. Lewis Hamilton had a weekend to forget in his Mercedes, having a nightmare in qualifying and in the race. But he did have one particular high point. He got to drive Ayrton Senna's 1990 championship-winning McLaren. We know Hamilton is a huge Ayrton Senna fan, and he was given permission by the family to drive the car. The conditions were clearly very tricky, and it didn't happen on Saturday, but thankfully he did get into the car on Sunday, and he very much seemed to enjoy it. And it was a cool moment, especially to drive it in Brazil. We know that Lewis Hamilton is very loved in Brazil. He loves the country. He may have even done the race in that car if he was allowed to. A very cool moment. There is now a full 2-week gap before the next race in Vegas, and honestly, I feel like I do need some time to digest everything that happened in Brazil. It was pretty bonkers by any stretch of the imagination. The most bonkers weekend I can remember for a long time. We were at the end now of a very hectic triple header, but we do have another triple header to finish the season. 2 full weeks off before we head to Vegas, Qatar, and Abu Dhabi. Qatar is also the final sprint race of the season. But if Max can win or do well in Vegas, he can actually take the title in Vegas. That would be a pretty special place for a party, wouldn't you say? Well, I've got a lot of information coming on Vegas. I've actually got some behind the scenes footage as well for when I was there a couple of weeks ago. All of that coming before the Vegas Grand Prix. Hope you liked this video. If you did, like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.